Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for every day that you give us as a gift from you. We thank you for the grace and the mercy that you give us each morning and each day to persevere in our academic work and in our personal lives for your honor, for your glory. I pray tonight that as we hear from the candidates, that you would give them wisdom in their words, and that we would listen well, that we would process what they have to say wisely and well, that you, again, would be honored in all of that, and your kingdom would be built in whatever way you choose. And we pray these things in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. All right. So without further ado, Mr. Renacci, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be running for governor?
Sure. Well, I think it's important that we kind of start there, because not only was I in Congress, I want to really go back to my roots. I think it's important to realize that I grew up in really a blue-collar union family in western Pennsylvania that didn't have anything. I mean, my parents struggled to make ends meet. Not the same story as Joe that you're going to hear, but my dad lost his job when I was 8 years old. My mom was a nurse. She kept us going. And I was always taught one thing, that no matter what in life, if you work hard and do the right thing, anything's possible. And that's what brought me to Ohio, because when I was 24 years old, I moved to Ohio with just a couple $100s in a bank account, and the idea that anything here is possible. I started my first business. I went from one business to 60 businesses, created over 1,500 jobs, and employed over 3,000 people. So that was really my life. It wasn't politics, even though politics is involved in almost everything we do. Politics was not what drove me and the ambition for me to be successful. And I'm proud to tell you, starting in that blue-collar union family today, I am somebody who can claim I live the American dream. And the American dream can be and should be something for all of you. Now, during that time and during building the business, I also always believed in giving back. I was a firefighter in my community. I was also a baseball coach. So those were the things that I did to give back to my community. But I also always believed that you should give back in as many ways as you can, whether it was in my church. I was an usher, I still am an usher for almost 38 years. But the city of Wadsworth was also struggling, and the city was losing close to $1.8 million on an $80 million budget. And the business leaders all got together and said, we really need to change. And many of them kept asking me to run for mayor. I didn't want to. I didn't want to be involved in politics. But I agreed to give back. I ran for mayor. Ended up getting elected. And then I converted a approximate $2 million deficit to a surplus without raising taxes. So I started to understand how government works, how government waits, how things happen. At the same time, as soon as I was done, I left. And again, some people call that politics. I call that community service, because you get paid, I got paid $1,500 a year to be a mayor. That is not something you can live on. That's just giving back. But at the same time, what really drove me to be a congressman, which is what I told you earlier, is I also had a Chevy dealership in Wadsworth. And that Chevy dealership was booming. And when I went to college, like all of you, I couldn't afford college. My parents couldn't afford college. So I worked 3 jobs. One of them was a truck driver. I literally took tractor trailer and drove building supplies around western Pennsylvania 2 days of a week. I was also on a road crew in the summer. And I also worked as a mechanic in a Chevy dealership. So that was another thing that gave me, the real insight that I wanted to own a Chevy dealership, and I ended up owning one. And I said, this is what I want to give to my children and grandchildren. The problem was, federal government took over General Motors back in 2009. They actually went after dealers, and my dealership was taken from me. So think about that when you think of the overreach of government. I had a dealership taken away from me. I didn't know what to do at that time. I had 59 employees, $3 million invested. I contacted my U.S. congressman. He came, he went around the dealership, he told me how he was going to help me. The problem was, when I went back to Washington, there was a vote to reinstate my dealership and everyone else's, and he voted against it. Now, that was the second kick in the stomach. What I did then is I called him and I said, not only are you a liar, but you're somebody that I'm gonna remove from that office even if I have to run. So I literally jumped into the race. 30 days later, 14 months later, I'm proud to tell you that I became a United States Congressman. Now, that's the story of how I got into politics. Once I got there, I realized, well, I always tell the story. I got there and I thought, wow, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, all of these people have been here. What's the poor guy from Western Pennsylvania doing here? And then I looked around at the other 400 and some people and I said, what are they doing here? Because the problem is we elect people sometimes just because we like them, they look good, they smile, they shake your hand, but we never do the background experience to really determine whether they are electable or whether they should be electable. And what I found very quickly after being in Washington, that it was so broken that the only place we can fix our country is by fixing it in our states. Remember, if you're doing your history lessons and teachings, you remember that we gave the federal government limited power. Now today, they have absolute power, and they're telling us to do things that we shouldn't have to do. So you know how we fix that? We put strong governors in place who say no. We put strong governors in place who say no more to the federal overreach, no more to the federal bureaucracy, no more to what's going on even in our country today. No more, we've had enough, we're taking your power back, we're going back to where we're going to give you limited power. So after 6 years in Washington, I could still be a congressman. I was on the Ways and Means Committee, the most powerful committee in Washington. But after 6 years in Washington, I realized that it is so broken that we need to get back and fix it at our state level. And that's why I came back, and that's why I jumped into the governor's race. Now, I will tell you, I jumped into the governor's race in 2017 against the current governor because I did not believe at that time he had the background and experience to really take our state forward. I can tell you that the policies of the last 3.5 years have actually taught me that I was right, and that we really do need a state that's much stronger. It has, and we need to be able to compete. We need to be able to compete with the other states. So we can't do that right now. We rank anywhere from 35th to 50th, and we can go through all those details after Joe tells you a little bit about himself. But I want you to know that I'm a 38-year businessman, and with 8 years in the House of Representatives. But my business background is what gives me the background experience to know that I can be a great governor for the state of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Mr. Knopp, if you wouldn't mind answering the same question.
Sure. So, Joe Knopp, running obviously as Lieutenant Governor with Mr. Renacci here. I think the first time I called you Mr. Renacci. But, so my story, we all have a unique story. Some of you, I think, heard it when I shared the movie Unplanned that I was a producer for, probably about a month or so ago, thanks to Julia. So I actually grew up in Philadelphia, unfortunately not Ohio, as I run for governor of Ohio, but it is where our country was born and founded, and I would argue the American dream also. I was born into a rough family situation. I have 2 older sisters. There was a lot of abuse, alcohol, drugs, physical in our household. When I was 5 years old, the police actually came and took my mother, my 2 sisters, and myself away from our dad, and then never saw him again to this day. And our mom, unfortunately, was not in a great position to really take care of us. So for the next 2 years, we just lived on the streets. And that consisted of stealing for food, living in abandoned houses, now we probably call them crack houses, and just survived. Now when you're one of those kids, or are other street kids, so it's not that uncommon, but we didn't know any better. About 1 block down from where we normally hung out, my sisters found this little corner church called Bethel Temple. And somehow they read a sign on the window that said, if you come to Sunday school and stay for the hour, we'll give you free Dunkin' Donuts and orange juice. So that was enough for us to go. And we went there several weekends in a row. And the church kind of took notice to us. The church probably had 25 people on a weekend. It was a big service. But probably a few weeks after us going there, actually the local elementary school called the church and said, hey, these 3 kids, the Knopp kids, they haven't been at school for the past quite a few weeks, but we've heard they've been seen at your church. Can you help us figure out their situation and their whereabouts? So this amazing man named Wes Whitehead, very successful architect in Philadelphia, had a heart for inner city Philly. He actually took it upon himself to walk the streets. And when he tells the story, it was end of November. He was literally going in and out of the abandoned houses. And when he found us 3 kids, it was cold out, it was cold in the house. We were wearing t-shirts. He later found out our mom sold our coats and jackets for money. And he figured out which lady was our mom and got permission from her to take us to this orphanage that he wasn't involved in. So when I was 7 years old, I got placed in an orphanage in Philadelphia. My sisters went to a separate one, and I stayed there until I graduated high school. After high school, I wanted to go to college. I wasn't really prepared or taught the best way to afford college, but God did bring a Air Force recruiter into my life and said if I enlist in the Air Force, that they will pay for my college. So I was 18, enlisted in the Air Force, did about 6 months of training in Texas, and then I got stationed at a place called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, about 20, 30 minutes from here. And I was 19 when I got stationed there, and that was almost 30 years ago, which is crazy. While there, I went to a place called Wright State University, if I can say that in here, which, by the way, if I look at my phone, they're playing in the March Madness right now, so I'm just looking at the score. So, and then, so went to Wright State, got a finance degree. Most importantly, met my wife in Dayton, Ohio, and her family is here. Most of them live in Cedarville, actually, so I've been to Cedarville many times over the past 30 years or so. But after I got my finance degree, after I got out of the Air Force, I had my own finance practice for about 10 years, until a good friend of mine that I grew up with, actually, his name was Daryl. He was actually my youth pastor when I was growing up. He had a heart for Hollywood, a heart to tell stories. Despite our conservative church saying it's the devil's playground, you can't go to Hollywood, he felt like, the excuse we use as Christians, I want to be that bright light in a very dark spot. So he had the courage to go out there. But after being out there for about 15 years, he was getting so frustrated with the types of movies he was being asked to produce and the types of messaging he was asked to send through his entertainment. So we would always talk about that. He knew that I appreciated story because I've been able to share my story a lot over the years, just with my background. And we used to call it testimony when I was a kid. Now I feel like we used to call it story. But Daryl, he wanted to leave the Warner Brothers, the studio mechanism, and start making independent movies to tell our stories. And a lot of you are fairly young in here. I'm not sure if you remember Christian movies like 12, 15 years ago. They were not good. So Daryl, I was the only business finance guy that he knew. He called me to help out to make movies at the level that he was used to making with Warner Brothers. So I never left the area, but I would start traveling to LA and also for production. The first movie we did was called Woodlawn, and it took on racial injustice. The second movie was called I Can Only Imagine, based on the song that most of us probably know. The third one was Unplanned, which we watched here a month or so ago, the pro-life movie. And then the latest project I did was a documentary with the Trump family called The Trump I Know. After doing Unplanned is really kind of what brought me into the political environment. I will say it's much more fun to be the fun film producer in the political world than actually being the candidate. Everyone's a lot nicer to you when you're just the film producer. But when we did Unplanned, I got invited to about 10 different state capitals to show the movie, to help our side try to bring that message across to the left, to help them understand what abortion really is. I also got invited to the Capitol in D.C. by folks like Senator Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, James Lankford, to help them show the world what abortion really is. And then Vice President Pence and the Trump family brought me to the White House. And that's when I first started hearing these great stories about the Trump family. And what I feel like God's gifted me with is telling stories. So all these stories from the Trump family just felt like the media is not going to tell them, and that's what encouraged me to make the documentary about them. And we filmed it in 2020 during the campaign, and it was a pretty surreal experience. I got to spend time and interview President Trump in the White House. And I live in Spring Grove, Ohio. That's not something I get to do very often. But after those projects is when quite a few people in Ohio asked me to consider running for statewide office. And so that consisted of kind of traveling around the state, speaking at pro-life events, speaking at GOP party events, Unfortunately, or fortunately, the people that were asking me to consider running with them, some are household names for Ohio. I just felt like they were not the right people to run with. Not only a gut feeling, but as I heard them speak, as we all know here at Cedarville, we needed the same person Sunday morning as we are, the rest of the week. And I just felt like that wasn't consistent with a lot of people in this space. So actually, my wife was probably the happiest moment of her in the past years when I said, I don't think it's time for me to get involved in politics. Because she was excited. But then Laura Trump was instrumental in helping me spend time with Jim Renacci. And the more that I heard Jim's story, which you just heard, the more I spent time with him and his wife and understanding more about his family. Really appreciate who he is as a person individually, but what his plan is for the state of Ohio. So when he asked me to be his running mate, I was very honored and humbled. My wife knew then that it was a God moment, not a Joe moment, because we had already surrendered the idea. So that's how we got to be here to speak to all of you tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Knopp. All right. My first question will be for you, Mr. Knopp. You can take a drink real quick. Why do you think it's important for us as Christians to be involved politically?
Well, if you watch the news and see how the left is doing, running our country, and seeing where that has led us over the past 14 months now, that's probably one good reason where we should get involved. But at the same time, the left has been very strategic in bringing their plan and their message to light. What I like, education, entertainment, and media, the big three that they have utilized. And their message could not be any more 180 degrees different than what our belief is. And as Christians, we have to defend our God-given rights, but also we have to defend our reasons for believing in God. And when you look back to where this country was founded, and again, from Philadelphia, God and Scripture is in every part of our documents. If you go to DC, you go to all the buildings there, I've been to most of them, there are Scripture wrapped around a lot of these buildings, the White House, the Capitol, the museums. It's how our country was founded. So in order to get back to where this country was founded, we as Christians, as believers, have to be involved in politics. We have to fight. We have to fight the way God wants us to fight up against the left. And my passion for the past 10 years has been doing that through entertainment. I believe, very strategically for decades. If you watch TV tonight, the left have been messaging brilliantly through there, and we have to do the same and combat that.
Wonderful, thank you, Mr. Knopp. My next question is for you, Mr. Renacci. And this is kind of general, so I apologize, but what policies are important to you?
Well, look, when it comes to policies, I think first off, the one thing that I truly believe in is that we have a state that can't compete anymore. We can't compete with other states. If you look at the states that are excelling, it's Texas, it's Tennessee, it's Florida, South Dakota. The policies that drive them are really the necessary needs in Ohio, things that we have to do. So when you talk about broad policies, I think my first starting point would be the policies that I want to change in Ohio, or the policies that will make Ohio, one of the top 10 states in the country. Now, to do that, you got to look at spending, you got to look at tax policy, you got to look at a lot of policies. So it's not easy to say, well, there's just one simple thing. But I think there are also other things. I think Ohio should become one of the most pro-life states in the country. So that's another policy. And at the same time, we should be protecting our Second Amendment rights. It's another policy. But we should have a policy of smaller government, which we don't. I mean, in Ohio, the budget just went from 76 million to 80 million. So when you think of smaller government, think of this. Ohio has 10.7 million people. Florida has 22 million people, so almost twice as many people. Ohio's budget is $80 billion. Florida's budget is $88 billion. So think about that. And then you got North Carolina and Georgia, which are about the same size, statewide, same size population, yet their budgets are 40 and 45 billion. So why is Ohio at 10.7 million people spending $80 billion, and states of similar size spending 40 or 45 billion, and why is Florida, it's twice the size, spending only 8 billion more? We got issues within our spending. And again, I can tell you the other thing about Ohio, a lot of people don't realize. Ohio really only has 4 major spending areas. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, it's a state, you got all these spending areas. No, roads and bridges, Medicaid, prisons, roads and bridges, Medicaid, prisons, and what's the fourth one? Prisons, roads and bridges, Medicaid, and education. So those are the 4 issues that Ohio spends this $80 billion on. And what we need to do is start looking at those areas and figuring out ways that we can bring those spending down, just like we do in a business, compete with the other states, change our tax policy so that we can compete with other states, but at the same time, remember the life issue, the gun issue, and the smaller government should all be part of the policies as well. I could tell you specifics all day, but we'd be here for 6 to 8 hours by ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. So, kind of a follow-up question. What is your stance on red flag laws in particular?
So that's Second Amendment. So here's the one thing that you should always know about Jim Renacci. All these issues came before me in Congress. You know, the red flag laws were brought up in Congress. And the first thing I always did in Congress was say, okay, let's take a look at it. Let's understand what it means. Let's make sure that it works or doesn't work. I remember having a Republican colleague come to me and say, she was from Indiana, and she said, we just passed red flag laws in Indiana, and we need to pass them in Ohio. And I said, wow, okay. And then I had another colleague from another state. That's what's great about Congress, is you've got other states and other opinions. And I had another colleague saying, we shouldn't be passing red flag laws because it doesn't allow for due process. So I said, okay, well, let me take a look at all these things. Here's what I would tell you about red flag laws. The biggest problem is they do not provide for due process. And nobody should ever have a gun taken away from you in a country that believes in the Second Amendment just because somebody says, here's the perfect example. A wife and a husband are in a bad relationship, and the wife goes and says, my husband has a gun and it should be taken away from him because he's a threat. That's a red flag, right? And under the rules today, if you had a red flag law, that gun could be taken away from that husband, all right? These are with no due process, with absolutely no due process. So I am never going to support a law that doesn't give us due process.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Mr. Knopp, you kind of already spoke to this as far as Christians being involved and a little bit more of what you initially told us about yourself. But do you think you could go into a little bit more detail about why you personally are involved politically? Or even just, in the media?
Sure. So my kids are 17, 14, and 12. And I, actually my 17-year-old is regretting not being here tonight because he heard there's girls at Cedarville. But he's actually, he's playing baseball right now down in Florida. He goes to a Dayton Christian and they're on spring break down there. But I'm, definitely fighting for my kids for several reasons. One, as far as running for office in Ohio, a lot of studies show us that when a lot of you graduate, some of you will go on to postgraduate studies. A lot of you will leave the state of Ohio to get the job that you're studying to get. Selfishly, I want my kids to stay nearby. My wife would like my kids to stay nearby. I want to make sure we have job opportunities in Ohio for smart, college kids to be able to accept. I also, as far as what I believe in, the life issue. So we took on the life issue with a movie. Ohio should be the most pro-life state in this country, and Jim and I actually, we have an opportunity to put Ohio on the map, being the most pro-life state that this country has ever seen. And we will protect that those babies and that right as long as you all will let us do that. You know, a lot of the beliefs that we have here, especially as believers and as Christians, they have been stepped on. We watch the media and they're getting stepped on every day. And they are very strategic about it. I could go on with, you know, even the gay and lesbian movement. If you go back and study it, it's a little bit harder to now. They washed a lot of it offline. But in the mid-'80s, when the HIV and AIDS epidemic was in this country, it was blamed on that demographic. They were struggling for acceptance. And very strategically, it took 2 years to gather their leadership. But they gathered and they said, we need to unite. We need to put our small differences aside, and we have to unite with what we all believe in. Sometimes I think Christians need to do a better job of that. But in that meeting, it was a weekend retreat in a political retreat center in Virginia. That second day, what they decided is we need a strategy. And what they very intelligently chose was entertainment. Because back then, there's really only 3 main networks. And what they understood is, if we can get one of us portrayed into every living room in this country in a very lovable, likable way, then we're going to have the empathy of the American audience. So they came out, a couple years ago, they came out with a show called Will and Grace, and it put this fun, lovable character into our living rooms that a lot of people started watching that show. The second goal was on the big screen, they wanted to be portrayed by Hollywood elitists in a movie. And you're probably all too young, but a movie called Philadelphia came out. Tom Hanks played the main character of a guy with AIDS who was dying. And if you YouTube Tom Hanks' Oscar-winning speech for that movie, he knew who he was championing and how he was using film as a way to get that message across. So here we are decades later, and if I go to pitch a movie, and I know this from experience, if I want to pitch a movie about the disciples to NBC Universal, they're going to say, great, which character is transgender? I'm like, it's the disciples. Like, have you read? We've all read the but they're like, that's okay. In order for us to release an entertainment product today, we just need one of those characters to be transgender. And that's where we're at from an entertainment standpoint. That's really where we're at from a government standpoint. So if we don't step up as believers and be champions for what we believe in, be champions for our families, be champions for our kids, no one's going to do that. And we'll look like countries around the world that we don't want to look like.
By the way, I wanted to add 2 things to what Joe just said. We've agreed to appoint a protector of the unborn in our cabinet. So that's something that you've never heard of before. We truly believe that. That's how much we believe in life. The second thing, you talked about leaving. We're the 7th most left state in the country. 7th most left state. People are leaving this state and going elsewhere. As Joe said, we want people to stay here. We want our kids and grandkids to stay here. We want all of you to graduate and stay here. But I guarantee you, most of you will graduate and will not stay in Ohio.
Thank you, both of you, for that. My next question is also for you, Mr. Knopp. Mr. Renacci shared about a few issues that are important to him. Obviously, you're very well known in the pro-life movement in particular, but what are maybe some other issues that are also very important to you? Obviously, you can talk about pro-life as well.
Yeah, pro-life, and I think we've said enough about that. We will be the most pro-life governor, lieutenant governor in the state that this country has ever seen. Also important to me is education. How many here went to a public school? All right, over half of you. My guess is, especially with the age that you're at, that the farther you got through public school education, the more indoctrination that was being brought into your heads, and that you had to, most likely with your Christian beliefs, had to combat that, and most likely your parents equipped you for that. Again, just like entertainment, the left has been, I hate to say, but brilliant about using entertainment or education to indoctrinate kids at all levels of beliefs. You look at even gay, lesbian, transgender, you know, alcohol, drugs, even the breakdown of the family. Education is teaching that all of that is okay, all of that is normal. In fact, our school system also are trying to indoctrinate kids that parents aren't really that smart. Now, some of us probably thought that to begin with, but they're literally trying to push kids away from their parents. Now, unfortunately, in today's environment, studies show half those kids only have one parent. And that parent is working probably 2 jobs to try to raise those kids. So they are not growing up in an environment that is protected outside of school. So many of these kids are, I would argue, being abused in the school environment. So part of my passion is to make sure not only do we protect the unborn, but we protect all kids all the way through education, all the way through college. And as governor and lieutenant governor, we have a chance of doing that. So education is definitely a passion.
By the way, one of the top priorities of the Renacci and Joe administration will be education. It's on the top. I mean, eliminating CRT, eliminating social emotional learning, you know, eliminating comprehensive sex education, and then developing a plan so that parents and the children and the child can decide what school they go to by having choice through a backpack bill or something like that. So that's going to be a priority. There are a couple other priorities of the Renacci and Joe administration also will be, though, taking care of our homeless veterans long before we take care of illegal immigration. Illegal immigrants should not be, we should not allow for illegal immigrants to come to Ohio when we have homeless veterans that are still living on our streets. And third, major one is election integrity. Every one of you will be voting or has voted. We need to make sure that election integrity is taken care of in the state by making sure that everybody has a voter ID, and also that we do comprehensive audits on a regular basis so that we can test the voting. So those are kind of our 3 major priorities, along with life in the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Now, I have to ask and follow up about your statements on education. To both of you, as I'm sure many of us know, in the past week or so, Florida has passed what has been popularly called the Don't Say Gay law. And I know that some people are saying that it didn't go far enough. What are both of your takes on that?
You want to go first? Yeah, so, look, I mean, here's what I've often said, and it's amazing. Now, I do like Governor DeSantis, and I like the positions he takes, and I'm a strong advocate for many of the positions he takes. But one thing I learned, and I'm Catholic, so I'm a faithful Catholic. You have all kinds of Catholics. You know, you have Joe Biden, practicing Catholic. You got Nancy Pelosi, Bob Catholic. I mean, that's what they call themselves. I'm a faithful Catholic, which means I support the Catholic doctrine. And the one thing I have learned in its entirety is that even my Catholic priest will say, it doesn't matter whether you're gay, transgender, no matter what, we're all human beings, and we need to make sure that discrimination in that issue is not ever brought forward. So I don't know why we would call anybody anything but a human being that is an Ohioan, a Floridan, or whatever, and I think in the end that's really what we should be doing. You know, it doesn't mean you have to condone the issues, but at the same time, as I've learned many times, I always say, here's the stone, cast it first. I mean, in the end, we're all God's creatures, and we really should not have names for ourselves. We should all realize that everybody has challenges in this country, everybody has challenges in life, and what we should really do is understand that before we criticize it, and there should be we shouldn't be calling any individual category a name or whatever, so.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Mr. Knopp?
Yeah, I'll add to that, and it's funny, I feel like Jim's like the play-by-play guy, and I'm like the color commentator, so I will, for me, when I think of, the gay lesbian movement, with all these issues, I try to peel back the layers to the why part. So so compared to abortion, as horrific as it is, that's not the actual problem. The problem is unwanted pregnancies, right? So we got to figure out why we have unwanted pregnancies and start peeling back those layers. If we can fix the issue here, no one will be in a position to even make that choice or decision, right? So it's the same thing when I think of the gay and lesbian topic issue. We got to figure out why. Because there was a time, like I'm 48 years old, when I was in high school, I honestly don't think we had a single person in our high school actually consider themselves, gay or lesbian. But, as the years have gone on, younger and younger to now, and my daughter's in 6th grade, and like in elementary school, there are kids like, I don't know, maybe they don't know. But what you find is a lot of kids are growing up in an environment where, the way I describe it is we all have the desire to belong. And growing up in an orphanage, I understand that. I'm probably an expert in that category of wanting to belong. And we are hardwired that way. That's how God made us. What we know, most of the people in the room here, is probably that only God can ultimately fulfill that desire. Now, second is family. And we're hardwired for family. And if we're not getting our arms kind of wrapped around us by family, we will seek it out elsewhere. We have to. It's our innate desire to belong. So you have these kids who are seeking out a place to belong, and heaven forbid they're like kind of the odd kid out. Maybe they like music. Maybe like in my industry where they like to entertain people. Well, that might not fit the perfect category where they're supposed to be. So the gay and lesbian movement has done a brilliant job of just wrapping their arms around these kids. And there's lots of examples. Ellen DeGeneres, if anyone's heard her tell her story, where she is just sobbing with the abuse that she went through by men when she was younger. And you hear her story, it's hard to not be empathetic for why she, has shunned men altogether. So I believe as Christians, as Catholics, as human beings, it's really important for us to understand the why part. And just because they, gay and lesbian kind of wear what I would call like that scarlet letter on their chest, where a lot of times we as Christians like to deflect our own issues onto them. But I guarantee if I was in every one of your minds right now or in the past hour, there might have been a thought that you shouldn't be having. I know that because I am also human, and I won't tell you what mine is. But that being said, we have to understand that we all have struggles in life. And the day that we accept our own struggles and don't deflect onto others, and we are empathetic to the person sitting next to us, then we actually have a chance of working well together, uniting around what's really important. So it's a winded answer to what your question was, but that's my passion.
Thank you. Mr. Renacci, what is your plan to foster unity among Ohioans?
Well, let's face it, we're in a very divided country. I learned that in Washington. I will tell you that the number one thing I learned is as strong as you believe in something, there's somebody right across the table that believes the total opposite just as strong as you do. And once you realize that, especially in Washington, remember there's 435 members in Congress, so when I went there, you think, well, everybody thinks the way you do. No, they don't. No, they don't. In fact, there's some people that think the way you do, and there's some people that think totally opposite the way you do. That doesn't mean you can't be friends. That doesn't mean you can't work together. That doesn't mean you can't get things accomplished. I always use the story, and I'll never forget this, and it goes back to what we were talking just before about gays and lesbians. I was at a dinner, and I was sitting next to a guy. It was a bipartisan dinner. I was sitting next to a guy, and we were talking about how we were going to be able to work together on a certain bill that would help Ohio. Now, I didn't think about who he was. He was from Rhode Island. He was talking about the things that we should do and how we should work together, right? And so I go back to my office and I tell my staff, look, the guy 3 doors down, we got an idea. It's going to be good for Ohio. It's going to be good for Rhode Island. We got to work on it together. And the first thing they said to me, did you know that guy is openly gay? And I said, well, first off, I didn't judge him by that at all. I mean, here's what I judge. I judge if he had an idea that was going to help Ohio and help Rhode Island, and we should work together on it. That's what I judged about it. And that was how I was able to bring people together in Washington. You know, I had the same story, you know, a month later. I was at another bipartisan dinner, and a woman sitting next to me is talking about another idea that we could work on together and get things accomplished. And I go back to my office, and they kind of look at me, and they were afraid to say anything. And I go, what's the problem? And they go, well, do you know she's openly bisexual? And I go, listen, no, I don't know that. Nor did I care, nor did I ask, nor was that anything I judged wrong. Here's what I judged wrong. She wanted to get something done, and she wanted to work together to move things forward for Ohio and for Arizona. She was for Arizona. And by the way, that person is Christina Sinema. Does anybody know who she is now? She's the senator who is actually protecting Republican values today in the U.S. Senate. Her and Joe Manchin are the two that are standing up for Republican values. So sometimes it's not about whether you're a Republican, it's not about whether you're a Democrat. It's about what your principles, policies, and positions are and how we can work together to get things done. I can tell you that in Washington, I had just as many friends on the Democrat side as I had on the Republican side. But I never had to give up my principles or values. What I always, the only thing I had to give up was my hand, to shake them. That's all you have to do. You shake somebody's hand and say, let's work together. So I think unity comes from talking about ways. You have a vision, you have a plan, and then you bring people together, and I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, I don't care whether you're gay, lesbian. If you can get behind a plan that takes Ohio forward, then that's how we unify. And that's what I would do as governor of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Next question is for you, Mr. Knopp. What has this campaign taught you so far?
Oh boy, he's learned a lot.
Let's see, it's my first time being in politics, so probably somewhere around 100 days now, I believe. So for the next 2 hours, I will tell you what it has. No, you know, for me, you know, it's interesting. One way to break it down is, you know, political science. Do we have any poli-sci majors here? Okay, a few. I think a lot of people perceive that political science is how to be a leader, how to run government, all of what that entails. Political science is actually the art and science of getting elected. Well, it's not much different than marketing, actually, right? I mean, that's what you learn, how to get elected. You know, leadership, you really can't be, you can be taught leadership skills, but just like, you know, Jim ran businesses for 40 years, and I ran some pretty good sized projects and businesses, that can't be taught in college. So political science is really, is the art of how to get yourself elected or someone elected. So for me, that was a big differentiation between the two, because there is zero doubt in my mind that, and I don't say this because I'm biased. I know the other candidates running for governor. I have met all of them, and I know them pretty well. I probably shouldn't even say this out loud, but my son, in 2018, DeWine used our school, Dayton Christian, for one of his commercials, used my kid's classroom. So I spent time with all the candidates, and I know Jim's, not only his heart, but his experience as a business operator for 40 years is the person to run this state for the next 8 years. We'll start with 4, and then we'll get 4 more. But I also know that marketing wins. You know, campaigning wins, and therefore, you know, there's not a whole lot of truth from a lot of camps when it comes to campaigning, and we have to battle that. So as believers in Christ who feel like we're really not supposed to lie, right? There's no shades of lying. You're either telling the truth or you're lying. That's challenging when other people, you know, on a daily basis lie. I won't use names, but there was a candidate just letting people know a few weeks ago that if you send in a bunch of money to them, to the totaling $1 million, then he's going to get a Trump endorsement. I was with a Trump that day. He never met this character before, but that's what happens in politics. It's so the challenge for me first time in politics, is how do I maintain who I am from a character standpoint, what brought me up in the first 48 years of my life, our strong beliefs. How do we maintain that, but still, defeat folks who are just lying on a daily basis? So that's probably the biggest challenge for me, because it's hard to bite your tongue sometimes.
I would just add something so you all know. It's kind of interesting because Joe's getting a quick lesson at it. But I'll tell you a little story. When I first got to Washington, first off, the one thing I never realized when I first ran, now Joe realizes it, you can lie in politics. Anybody can say anything. And it doesn't matter, you just can't lie bull, but you can lie. So you could say things that aren't true, it doesn't matter. And in Ohio, it's even worse, because Ohio laws say that you can lie. There's no stopping it. So anything can be said, and it can be a total lie. And even in one race, when somebody was lying about me, I went to the Ethics Commission and said, this is a lie. I gave them proof. I showed everything. They said, it doesn't matter. And I said, so what's the response? Well, spend money to show he's not lying. Now, that's one thing you have to learn about politics. But here's the best lesson in life I ever got about politics. I just win a seat in Congress. I get a mentor. This mentor, Steve LaTourette, was in Congress for 16 years. So he calls me into his office. I'm only in Congress for 4 days. And he says, Renacci, sit down there. He said, I'm your mentor. He said, can you accept betrayal? And I said, wow. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, can you accept betrayal? Can you accept somebody, your colleague or your friend, not only betraying you, but actually stabbing you in the back to get ahead of you? And I go, Steve, I'm not sure where this is going, but the answer is absolutely not. And he goes, and you will never like it in Washington. He says, and I promise you, betrayal and backstabbing from your best friends will occur within the first 10 days of you being there. And wouldn't you know, within 8 days, I got a phone call from Steve, and he said, you just got betrayed. So that's politics 101. You just got to have a thick skin. You got to understand people will lie. You got to also realize that betrayal and backstabbing appears to be part of the system. Now, can we fix that? Yes. And if you put people in office with good, we talked about Christian values. You put people in office with good Christian values, we can definitely change that.
Final question that I have on this paper for you is, what is your plan to turn the economy around in Ohio?
Well, I would tell you, and that's a great question. I've done a couple things to prepare for this. Number one, I've built and run over 70 business in totality. So I understand what it takes to create a job, employ people. I've lived it. Too often, people in politics have never done that before. And if you look at the other candidates, you evaluate them based on that. I mean, nothing against the current governor, but he's never created a job, he's never employed anybody, he's been in office for 45 years. Joe Biden, our president, has been in office for 45 years. He's never had to live within the real world and also have to live within the rules that people make. So that gives Joe and I the opportunity to say we have real life experiences. But here's the other problem. Anything I ever did in business didn't mean I had to rewrite the will. I mean, when I was in the nursing home business, I had never operated a nursing home before in my life. But you know what I did? I went around to the 10 top nursing homes in the state. I figured out what they were doing, and then I brought those ideas into the nursing home. When I was in the car business, I went around to the top 10 car businesses in the state, figured out what they were doing, brought their ideas in. When I became mayor of Wadsworth, it wasn't like I understood, how am I going to fix this? I actually traveled the state of Ohio, went to the top 10 cities in the state, took all of their ideas and brought them back and made Wadsworth one of the best cities in the state. So the answer is pretty simple. Today, Ohio ranks anywhere from 35th to 50th. When it comes to jobs and new business, we're anywhere from 45th to 50th. We're at the bottom of the rung. We're at the bottom of the rung. In fact, the Republican National Committee just came out yesterday and said that Republicans have led the country after COVID in re-energizing states with jobs. The problem was Ohio, which is a Republican state, was 32nd on that list. We are not anywhere competing how do we compete? It's pretty simple. I told you a little about spending. Gotta get our spending back in line. You know, you can't spend $80 billion when Florida's spending 88. So we gotta get our spending in line. And I have some ideas on that, whether it comes to education, whether it comes to Medicaid expansion. Perfect example, Medicaid expansion represents 52% of Ohio's spending today. But when Governor Strickland was around, which was 14 years ago, it was only 17% spending. So how did we get from 17 to 52? Well, there's a lot of reasons. We've got to fix that. That's number one. Number two, many states privatize prisons. Most states privatize prisons, yet we still operate them. You know, government does not operate things efficiently. So why are there only 4 or 5 states that run their own prisons and most of the rest of them privatize them? Well, let's look at that. Let's change that. Let's look at some of those issues. Workers' compensation, another big spending item at the state. You know, there's only 5 or 6 states in the entire country that still have their own workers' compensation system, and everybody else privatizes. Why aren't we privatizing that? Those are the kind of things we can do to bring costs down. Once we bring costs down, we can move to a consumption tax state. Now, I was telling the one gentleman earlier today that most people don't understand what a consumption tax is, and if you hear somebody say, well, I support a consumption tax, ask them what it means. Because a consumption tax is a very complicated thing. It's just not a sales tax. I mean, it is a cost that gets applied. It is a tax that gets applied. But if you put a consumption tax in place and eliminate all the income taxes, like Texas, like Florida, like Tennessee, like Nevada, you'll see an economy growing and booming. We can't do that today because we spend too much. We've already done some studies with the tax commission out of Washington, D.C., Tax Federation, who said Ohio spends too much. So we've got to get our spending down. We've got to change our tax system. We've got to change our regulatory system. And then what we've got to quit doing is we've got to quit paying for new businesses that come in. I commissioned the University of Akron 2 years ago to tell me why we're failing in Ohio. And here's what they told me. We still believe that if you spend, which we just announced, this state just announced that we're going to spend $2 billion to bring in Intel. And current administration is saying, yes, that's great. No, it's not. It's not great. We shouldn't be paying to bring jobs in. What we should be doing is having a state that is so job friendly that businesses come here without paying. So that's the goal, is how do we change the economy? Number one, we make it a place that businesses want to come. Now, one other thing. Businesses don't go first. People go first. We are in a changing world and a changing state. Businesses go where the people are. They don't go first and hope that people come. So one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of business coming to Ohio is because we don't have the people here first. But yeah, think about Ohio. What a great state we are. We got a beautiful lake to the north that nobody's paying attention to anymore. We got a river to the south, 2 amusement parks. We got 3 halls of fame. We got a national park in the center that nobody pays attention to. We got so many great things. We need to make sure that our lakes clean, our rivers clean. We need to make sure that we're promoting this great state, that you're all here getting an education in. And then we got to promote that this is the greatest place to stay, get a job, raise a family, grow a business, and people will stay. Instead of being the 7th most left state, we want to be the 7th most entered state. And we can do that by making sure that our state is one of the states that people just want to come to. I came here 38 years ago because it was the state. It was the state that people were coming to. Today, it's one of the top 10 states that people are leaving. That's how we fix the economy. We've got to change what we've been doing. The University of Akron said in their study, you can see that on jimrenacci.com, it's a 68-page study. The biggest problem is we spend money, bring business in, and then what happens to those businesses? They get more technologically advanced, and instead of 500 employees, it becomes 400 employees, it becomes 300 employees, and then they move. Or they stay, but they stay at a much smaller amount of employees. Lordstown, Ohio had a General Motors factory. Anybody know where Lordstown is? Northeast Ohio. Lordstown, Ohio. It left in 2018. Does anybody know where it went? Any guesses? I ask this question all the time. Where do you think the manufacturing of Lordstown, where do you think it went?
Mexico.
That's what everybody says. But you know where it went? Indiana. It actually, what happened is General Motors actually went in the state of Indiana, put in 20, it's funny because everybody thinks that. I went to Mexico, and you answered just like everybody answers it. But General Motors decided that it was much more business friendly. It was better for a tax. It was better from a tax standpoint to go to Indiana. It was better from a regulatory standpoint to go to Indiana. And I'll tell you the other thing it was better for, a lot of people don't want to talk about. It was also a right to work state. Every state around Ohio was right to work except Pennsylvania. So what they decided was it'd be better off to go to a right to work state too. We lost Lordstown. Lordstown today, which used to be a booming place, is now a dying community because we don't have the economic drivers to keep. We did not have the economic drivers to keep General Motors here. I don't know how many other manufacturing plants down here. You had Dayton, and up at the airport in Cleveland, the Ford plant. You go see the Ford plant now, it's totally knocked down because Ford decided there were better places to go than Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. The last question that I'll ask for tonight is both of you. What do you love about the state and the people of Ohio?
I can go first. It's an easier one than the last one. I spent a lot of time on the coast. I grew up on the East Coast and do a lot of work on the West Coast. And obviously a lot of liberal folks running those states. Amazingly, the majority of our country is what's called the flyover states, the flyover country, which is where our values can still be talked about publicly and represented. So, Ohio for me represents my opportunity at the American dream. I feel like we're still in the midst of it, but I literally lived on the streets of a big city and I grew up in an orphanage. And when I got brought to Ohio, it's where I, met my wife, and it's where I was able to get my college education. It was where I was able to start my own first business. And basically in today's environment, it's where I was able to make films that are seen around the world, still living in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio is very central to the majority of the country. You're about a 500-600 mile radius from 60-some% of the country's population. So there's a lot of things that I appreciate about Ohio, but I have had the opportunity to take my kids elsewhere and raise them other places, but I've been to all those places, no desire to raise my kids elsewhere. So my passion is to make sure my kids can stay here so they can raise our kids here. Jim's expecting his second grandchild. I'm sure he wants them to stay in Ohio, so that's my passion for Ohio.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about that. I mean, I didn't talk about my family before, but look, I married my high school sweetheart. We've been married for 39 years. I have 3 children. They were all born here in Ohio. They went to school here in Ohio. One of them left, so one of them is the 7%, top 7. One of them left. Hopefully he comes back. But in the end, I had the greatest opportunity in Congress to actually associate with 435 people. So I got to see values and principles from all these other states. And that was just a great opportunity for me. And there is nothing I can tell you better than Ohio Midwestern values. I mean, how many of you have gone to Florida? You ever go to the East Coast and the West Coast? East Coast is northeastern values, New York, and many of the, and so you go to that East Coast, you go to the West Coast, you got Midwest Ohio values. You can see the difference just in one side to the other side. Midwestern values is something that I've appreciated. Ohio is a great place to come buy a home. It's efficient. The housing prices are good. The problem is the job market and the companies aren't staying. But we have a great opportunity. So I would always say that what ranks the most. It's a great state with so many great assets and great Midwestern values. We just need leadership that understands that Ohio can get back to being in the top state in the country, but it's gonna have to change some things, not to continue to do what it's doing, and that's one of the reasons why Joe and I are running.
Thank you again to both of you. We are at 1 hour. Would you guys like to take some questions for a few minutes, or?
Sure.
Sure. Any questions? Yes.
So Nate's already sort of alluded to some of this a little bit, but I guess what would be some of the ways you would want to distinguish yourself from some of your rivals in the Republican Party, like Governor DeWine, for instance, and others who are running for the Republican nomination for governor?
So the question is, why would I want to distinguish myself?
Contrast.
Like, how would you, I guess, set yourself apart from the other Republican candidates running to be governor of Ohio?
Sure, so look, there's a few candidates running, here's the simple thing. One's a career politician, pretty simple. One has never created a job, one has never employed people, one has been in politics his entire life, one has lived off of a government paycheck from day one, signed the back of a government paycheck. Jim Renacci, I can tell you, has signed the front of paychecks. Created jobs, employed people, and understands what it is to live within the rules that government makes. So, very two extreme different backgrounds. The only thing that does also help me compared to some of the other candidates is, not only have I created jobs, employed people, run a business that was over $100 million, understand what it is, again, to operate under that level, which is the state of Ohio. But I also went into the belly of the beast, as I call it, for 8 years in Congress. So now I understand what the problems exist, how to get things done. That's a real asset. The asset's not being there 45 years. The asset's going in and seeing how bad it is, and understanding what needs to be fixed, and understanding how you can fix it. So that's another asset that distinguishes me from the other candidates as well. And then again, there's two other candidates in the race. One of them is a career politician as well. And the other one, I mean, you just gotta look at, you gotta compare. We all have records. And I think the best way of comparing myself to the other candidate is look at his background and experience and compare whether you believe that that candidate could be a governor. It's pretty interesting if you line them up. So I ran into a supporter of one candidate who said to me yesterday or the day before, well, I just want an outsider. Well, okay. Well, I consider myself an outsider. But then I also came back and I said, do you think the outsider that you support could be the governor? And she looked at me and said, no. And I said, good answer. I said, think about that as well, because it's a lot more than just being an outsider. As I said to one person here today, would you get into a plane? Would you get on a plane with a pilot who's never flown? I guarantee you wouldn't do it. I mean, would you hire a plumber that's never plumbed before? You've got to have a little bit of experience. You don't want to be a career person, but you got to have a little bit of experience to understand how to make a difference.
If you get elected, what do you foresee to be the biggest obstacles in making Ohio the most pro-life state?
Pro-life state?
Yes.
Well, the biggest obstacle is always going to be the people who don't want to be a pro-life state. I mean, I can tell you when I first ran for Congress, this is my political science degree. I always tell people I didn't have a political science degree, so my first 2 elections cost $30 million. So I got a $30 million political science degree. We did polling, and quite frankly, I'm shocked at the polling I've seen, but this would have been in 2009. 72% of Ohioans were pro-life. When I did polling in 2014, it was down to 53% are pro-life. So what's happening is things are changing. Pro-life isn't as important. Now it's important to me and it's important to Joe. But when you start asking people in Ohio, you see what's happened? We've shifted. Now those values shift, and I think the answer will be is to try and shift them back. Look, there is nothing more important in life. Nothing more important. I mean, it should be the #1 issue in everybody's mind, every day. You know, we should be protecting not only the life of the child. I spoke to one of the Right to Life organizations on Friday night. Here's what I said. When a baby's born, we have strollers that are have to protect. We have car seats that have to protect. We have a car now that when you get out of the front seat, it says, you got a child in the back, because it lets you know. So we protect that child from the minute he or she leaves the womb. And by the way, if you're a parent and you leave that child in the car and that child dies, you're going to jail. You're going to be prosecuted for that death. But yet, if you look at that unborn at 8 months and 7 months and 6 months, there's not much difference from that child who has been born. And yet, we're not protecting that unborn child. I mean, that is what we have to instill, in my opinion, that if life is so precious out of the womb, why aren't we protecting the child in the womb? And I think that's the obstacle. That's the answer.
And I'll add to that. I spent obviously a couple of years doing a deep dive in the life space. Always been pro-life, but part of what we have to do, we have to peel back these layers and figure out why do we have unwanted pregnancies. And I won't ask anybody to raise their hand, but you're in college, high school not too long ago. Did any of your friends or anybody that you know were they ever in a situation where they found themselves with an unwanted pregnancy? And if so, why was that? We have to break down the family. We have a lot of boys and girls who are just looking for a place to belong. Well, I can't promise that the government can step in, but we have to encourage all of you. We have to encourage the churches that we all attend to look out for others. I tell my kids when they are at school lunch, if there's ever a kid sitting by themselves, having lunch by themselves, you better pick up your tray and go eat with them. Because heaven forbid if I walk in and see a kid eating by themselves. Because the biggest issue that we face in this state and in this country now, I get emotional about it, but we have to look out for each other. And the best way to be a pro-life governor, lieutenant governor, is to care about the lives that a lot of families aren't caring about, and that'll prevent people from being put in a situation where they have to even make that decision. So that's on all of us. That's not just on the two of us.
I have a question for Joe. Okay. You mentioned that other candidates or another candidate had asked you or pursued you to run for governor or lieutenant governor. Was it governor?
Either one, they didn't care.
Either or. By process of elimination, I would have to say that's Ron Hood and Candace Keller.
I know them pretty well.
Okay. I was just at an event, a Hood Keller event, which Candace was the only one that showed up to that on 2 days ago. And I asked Candace this question because I had heard that she had pursued you to run, or they had pursued you to run for about 8 months or so. She had also posted on Facebook for a long time, I have the candidate, this candidate's coming, this candidate's coming. My question for you then, or comment, is when I asked her, I have specifically the words that she said, no, we never asked Joe Knopp to run for governor. Ron asked him to run as lieutenant, but nothing ever happened. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that would be the political science aspect of stuff that, yes, I met them early on when people were asking me to run, and I didn't know much about them, but one of them had recently lost an election to a Trump-endorsed candidate, and that he knew that he can never win an office in Ohio against a Trump-endorsed candidate. So their thought was, I can bring a Trump endorsement because I know the family, did a project with them. And so his exact words were, I don't care if I'm referring to himself, if I'm the lieutenant governor or governor, I just want it bad. And Joe, if you can bring the Trump endorsement, then we can run this state. But it's that attitude, it's that persona, it's that desire for the spotlight is exactly what was a turnoff for me. You know, I'm very happy making films. I love being able to get our message out through film. I'm honored to have the opportunity to run for Lieutenant Governor in the state alongside Jim. And we have a great chance of winning. I think a lot of people want what we can bring. But if for some reason it doesn't work out, we're going to be okay. We're still going to fight for this state and this country just as hard. It won't slow down. But I feel like, you know, in the entertainment world, what I've noticed is making movies. I got to work with some elite actors, you know, Dennis Quaid, John Boyd, Sean Astin, you know, Rudy, and they're great and really easy to work with. They've arrived, right? We all know their names. The divas that I worked with are the people you've never heard of. They have a very small role in the films. They want their own trailer. They want those green M&Ms, you know, just the green ones. And they're these crazy divas that we hear about. It's not the ones that are confident that they've already arrived. And there are so many people who want to be in politics because they taste a little bit of that limelight. And that's the problem with a lot of people in government today. They're in it for themselves, and they're not in it to give back, to govern, to help. They're in it to advance their own insecure careers. And I think God actually brought me through Hollywood to see that and to be exposed to that so that I can recognize it much quicker in the political world.
So both of you on multiple occasions said that you want to make Ohio the #1 most pro-life state, which I'd just like to say thank you because that's my #1 passion. But I'm just wondering how what steps you're going to take to get it that way, because I know that there's a lot of pushback from, I guess, just like a lot of the left-leaning, I guess, institutions who really just hate pro-life legislation. So I'm just wondering what you both are willing to do to just take those steps.
I think first, it's you know, the way that I operate is make sure all of Ohioans understand where, when, and what abortion looks like in the state of Ohio. I'm not sure if anyone here knows someone who has actually had an abortion, but that's a lifelong sentence of living with that regret. And if we can help people understand the impact that abortion has on a lot of Ohioans, I think that will help drive the left to at least having some of an empathy towards it. But there are other areas where abortion clinics, you know, technically they are supposed to operate as a surgery center. I have a little bit of a medical background, and therefore they have to have like hospital backup, hospital support in order to perform medical procedures. A lot of times that gets violated, so there are some other paths that we can take to make sure we do our best to bring it down. Jim's already mentioned that one of the people we will nominate is a life advocate, and that will be their full-time position, is to do all that we can to protect life. I'm sure Jim has a few.
I think Joe's hit the nail on the head. We just gotta, again, the biggest obstacles is gonna be the 47% that don't believe pro-life is as important. But I think it comes down to what I like about what Joe said is you have to determine how the individuals got into the situation they had where they don't want the child, but at the same time, then you have to protect the child. That's where it crosses right there. You don't want the child, but the child deserves the life. So how do we make that work? And look, I mean, it's got to be a priority. The biggest problem in government, here's what people don't understand, because people say, well, how are you going to be different? Here's what I learned about, and when I said the differences between me and some of the other candidates is, I can tell you my years and my time in Washington taught me very well. My time at the city of Wadsworth, politicians do not prioritize. So what they do is they prioritize one thing. Anybody know what it is?
Themselves?
Getting reelected. That's all they prioritize. How do I get reelected? In fact, in Washington, with a 2-year term, the day after you win, the next day you're starting to prepare how I'm going to win 2 years later. That's a problem. What we should be doing is prioritizing what needs to get done, prioritizing our spending, prioritizing life, prioritizing things. When you do that, then, and I'll tell you another thing Joe and I are gonna do, and I've said this on the campaign trail numerous times. If we're trying to get something passed and somebody, and a member of the House or Senate is not on the same page as we are, but we're getting people, then we're gonna take a little ride to that Senate district or that House district, and we're gonna have a town hall just like this, and we're gonna invite that member and say, okay, folks, let's talk about why life's important with Joe. If Joe was in the Senate or if Joe was in the House, and Joe would have to discuss it with his peers. And maybe his peers, maybe, or the people who've elected him. And maybe the people elected him would say, hey, we don't think life's important. Well, I mean, then the decision has to be made, but you gotta work at it, one district, one Senate district, one House district at a time. Oh, we got a bunch of hands.
Probably do 2 more questions and then time out. Yes?
With Joe Biden's closing of the gas pipelines and making the prices on gas go very higher, what is your plan to get the prices back down to a good price?
Well, there's a couple things we can do in Ohio. First, we got an abundance of oil and gas, but yet this government has decided our leadership has decided it's not important. We have to make it important. That's where we have to get away from the federal government. The federal government's saying it's not important, but as a state, we should make it important. So we should prioritize it. We should use as much of the natural assets. Look, I was in business. You take your assets and you use them to your benefit, you eliminate your liabilities. Your asset in Ohio is oil and gas. Your asset in California, Arizona is sunshine and wind. Let them do the sunshine and wind. Let us do the oil and gas. Let's make our assets plentiful for ourselves. But the other thing that we've talked about, right out of the gate, if I was governor today, I would suspend the gas tax and replace it with all the federal money. Look, this administration has been handed, by the way, all of you are gonna pay this back someday. I'm not going to. Joe's not going to. I look at age, and maybe you won't either, because we got a national debt that's just growing and growing and growing. And what our federal government did was they said, we're gonna give you, state of Ohio, $18, $19 billion extra. So we got a governor who's sitting on it, and it's election time, so he's spending it on all these little things, saying, what can I do to get votes here? What can I do to get votes here? Do you know what the simplest thing he should do? He should suspend the gas tax, let everybody who's driving get a break, and then take some of that 12 or 13 or 14 billion and replace what was coming in on the gas tax with that, so that people aren't hurt at the same time. Those are the 2 things we can do immediately to fix our energy problems. We should be energy independent. When I left Washington in 2018, the United States was energy independent. Today we're not.
Thank you so much.
Patrick?
I was going to ask, so it's pretty obvious that inflation is out of control with our current president. As governor and lieutenant governor, this is more directly to Jim, what would you do to fight inflation here in Ohio?
Well, I gotta tell you, the problem with inflation is being driven by the federal government. I mean, there's just, I'd be lying if I told you the governor could fix inflation or the lieutenant governor could fix inflation. The only thing we can do is try and provide, like I said, reducing, suspending the gas tax, trying to do some of those things. But right now we have supply chain issues. The Ukraine war didn't help that. That's going to drive up costs. We've got the COVID issue, which is we're still trying to fight out of that. All of these issues, and we're spending money like we haven't. And until we stop doing that, by the way, so is the state of Ohio. I mean, one of the things we need to do, I just told you, we went from 76 billion to 80 billion. I mean, that's a problem. We're spending money like we haven't too. But, so we're also causing inflation. And I think what we have to do is get our house in order, and some of that is cutting costs at the same time.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you, Mr. Renacci and Mr. Knopp, for coming out tonight.